Good morning. What I want to do is I'm going to sort of bounce around a little bit till these topics are related, but since I got them up. Ghyben-Herzberg lens. I'm pretty sure I mentioned this at the beginning of the semester, but I don't remember if I mentioned it. It's probably a good bet you guys don't remember if I did either. So just to go over that again, because that's an absolutely enormously key factor in Micronesia, given the incredibly small pieces of real estate we're talking about. Ghyben-Herzberg is just an effect that was first noticed, because you have to remember that people weren't even studying things like small oceanic islands and reefs until the post-World War II period, and that ironically was largely due to the fact that with World War II and invasions and fighting on these islands, the United States, well, the Europeans, but especially the Americans realized they had to know more about the places they were fighting because they didn't have a clue. And that's why there were all these early disasters in World War II when they were dealing with stuff that in hindsight you're sort of like, well, why wouldn't you know that? And they just didn't. So Ghyben-Herzberg is one of these things they sort of refine in the post-World War II period. So this is a Ghyben-Herzberg lens, this image from Wikipedia, which actually is a pretty decent article. So the key with Ghyben-Herzberg effect, which is actually what it is the fact that fresh water is ever so slightly lighter than seawater, salt water. And seawater tends to, if there's no movement of air, seawater tends to have a fairly strong surface tension. I know where the boat is out at Kehi, for example, if you end up with very light, fat rainfall drops blowing off of Kalihi and hitting into Kehi Lagoon, but there's not actually any wind on the surface, you can actually see the freshwater droplets sit for a second on the salt water till they dissolve into it. So it's like those really goofy, fancy drinks you used to be able to get, I suppose you'll be able to get again down in Waikiki, where you have different layers of like rums and stuff. And the reason they can do that is they weigh different amounts. So it's like the oil and water thing. So what happens is if you have dry land and it's, for example, sand and coral, which is sort of like a sponge, the rain, as you can see here in this image, the rain falls both in the ocean, where it just dissolves into the ocean, but the rain also falls here in the land. What happens is that water then sinks ever so slowly, think of it like going through a filter, into this area here, the substrate. Because this material is fairly solid, because remember, a lot of this is actually all volcanoes, so it's going to be basalts and stuff. Water doesn't seep through very quickly. So what happens is the fresh water comes in here, because of that difference in gravity, it actually sits on top of the salt water. So you've got salt water here, you've got salt water here. But if this boundary layer is this fresh water, now because you've got this cap of porous material, the water comes in and it sits down here and it doesn't evaporate because, of course, it's underground. So over time, what's going to happen is this island, this piece of dry real estate, is going to capture fresh water and put it here. Because it weighs a different amount, it's lighter than the stuff on this side, it'll actually form sort of a bubble. And this is what we call the freshwater lens. Now, this is actually true of all islands. The Hawaiian Islands, for example, as with all the islands in Polynesia, are Ghyben-Herzberg driven. And you have to remember, the islands have been around here. If you've been around for a million years, you've captured a lot of water. But the trick to all this is if for some reason we've got, I think it's supposed to be a pump. So if we actually go and we start sucking this water out really rapidly, so all of a sudden we start pulling this water out, what's going to happen is just think it's squeezing a sponge. This fresh water is going to shrink. It's going to move up towards here. If you move it too fast, what'll happen is it'll be the same as falling out here. All of a sudden there'll be sort of a whoomp and no noise, but what happens, all of a sudden this freshwater lens mixes with the seawater, because the only thing that kept them separate is the fact it was absolutely still. The minute you induce movement into it, you lose this. Now we've lost our freshwater lens on Oahu for the Ewa plain. It disappeared in the late 1980s, early 1980s. I know because I don't remember the Board of Water Supply at the time. And so that lens disappeared. All of a sudden, about 15, 20 wells went salt within the space of about 3 days. So that was the freshwater lens that was the southwest corner of the island of Oahu. They were sucking so much water up for agriculture, but especially for housing and such like that, lawns, people washing cars, that they lost the whole thing. So ironically, what then happens is you have to tap the other freshwater lens in other parts of the island to make up for that loss, which is why the Board of Water Supply constantly complains, though no one listens, that we actually don't have enough water to last, because we're at the point where we could literally turn on our taps and tomorrow morning all the water, for example, on this side of the island suddenly shows up salt, because we depend largely on our aquifer here. to basically get our water from. Now, if you have a really small piece of real estate, like say, let's switch over here. Oops, what happened here? Hold on, time out. Okay, like here, Kwajalein. So if you watch the Rocket Island video, this is that place. So here we've got incredibly small. Here's a bite that they talk about in the video. Switch this up to satellite picture. You get this really small piece of real estate with, I can't remember how many thousand people living in it. You can visualize your freshwater lens is under here. But with all these people who need fresh water, and you don't have anywhere else to get it, because you have to remember this island only, I think the highest spot of real estate is like 20 feet high. So when it rains, when rain comes across, it's a squall. It's like we see out the channels here. There's nothing that guarantees this place is going to get any rain. It might get some, but it's entirely a crapshoot. Just because it's trades or conas or whatever, doesn't mean they're actually going to see any water, because they don't have any way to capture the clouds. They don't have any way to capture the winds. So it either hits or it doesn't. So these places can basically be, in some ways, as they used to be called, desert islands. They're entirely dependent on the water that over hundreds of thousands of years has been caught by these dry sections and basically sort of stored in those bubbles under here, which is their Ghyben-Herzberg lens. Now that's fine as long as you're one of the ones like this that doesn't have a lot of stuff on it, because you don't have a lot of people living here. So, you know, the chance of you actually digging one hole in the ground, decide that you want to have a swimming pool and ruin it in Ghyben-Herzberg lenses is not that large. But if you think about it, if you pack, we'll say 10, 15,000 people on this here, all of a sudden everyone decided they wanted to wash their car and take a bath at the same time, you could very conceivably just entirely lose this aquifer. You can lose that Ghyben-Herzberg lens, and at that point, your only option is distillation, which is incredibly expensive. It's a normal water bottle like you guys use when you come to class would cost you about $15 to $25 to fill it with water if you had to depend on distillation. Because remember, this is your vast majority here is salt water. You'd have to, but through use of energy, take a lot of energy. You'd have to somehow take the salt out to distill or filter it out, and then you have the fresh water left. So when you get into Micronesia, one of the really, really key aspects is not only the fact that you've got small pieces of real estate, but human life is entirely dependent on the Ghyben-Herzberg lens. Now, because these things turn brackish, not completely salt, if you lose the lens, most of the vegetation here will survive. The human stuff, the yams or breadfruit or stuff that people planted, they'll die in a second. The coconut, the new, the hala, the pandanus, your, in some areas, mangrove, the plants that you see that grow here without human interference will persist. But what you're going to lose is everything else. So if you lose this, if somehow you screwed this up, we'll say that people lived here and they somehow did something stupid, they lost the Ghyben-Herzberg. It's going to take between about, in this island this size, probably about 500 to 700 years for that lens, if people completely leave it and abandon it, for that lens to recover. And this is the Marshalls that we're looking at here. In the Marshalls, there's any number of these smaller pieces of real estate that at one point had people on them, and they did exactly that. They did something stupid, and they lost their Ghyben-Herzberg. I believe that there's about 45 formerly inhabited islands in the Marshalls alone that are gone. Now, what that means then is the population you have has to then move to another piece of real estate, which puts more pressure on that. So, for example, if the people living here ruined this, so they move here to live with these people, the folks that were on this particular piece of real estate might have just barely been doing okay till all of a sudden you just stack a whole new crew of folks up here, at which point you're in trouble. And I can almost guarantee you this place is in trouble. That's way, way too many people. for such a small piece of real estate. It's very densely populated. So this is a place that you can almost guarantee either is literally within an incredibly short period of time of losing their Ghyben-Herzberg. And you know, the creepy thing about all this is folks in the Micronesian region know what the Ghyben-Herzberg is. They have for you know, probably 1,000 years, because they've done it. They've screwed up and lost it, and they've realized what you have to have, you know, how you have to behave to make this work. So what you get is a knowledge base that says you can't have too many people on a particular island. But you can't plant too many crops. You can't have a lot of swamp fallow or something like that. Yeah, you know, the weather might allow it, but you dig too many food pits into here, you dig too many little loei into here, too many planting areas, and you're gonna have that Ghyben-Herzberg lens will collapse on you and you're out of luck. So the reality of the Ghyben-Herzberg is this phenomenon. Now here you see one of the weirdest aspects of this. When the US military moves into here into Quality, one of the things that they'll do is put up golf courses, which take an enormous amount of water. And if you think about it, it has to be one of the most irresponsible things on the planet to do on an incredibly small piece of real estate that has people living there. Because if you screw up, if you water this lawn once too many, you lose all the water on this, and basically this place becomes uninhabitable for basically the next 600 to 700 years, just because you want to have a green to whack a little white ball into the hole. And sad to say, and here's a pool. Sad to say, this is very, very typical of the way we treat things in the Pacific. And again, Honolulu is a perfect case in point. We know there's a problem. The people in charge constantly say there's a problem, but developers put up more stuff. People wash their cars. There's no change in behavior. And when it finally goes south, then all of a sudden people are going to be screaming, "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you do something?" And they're just going to say, "Well, we tried. You wouldn't listen." But people aren't going to want to hear that. They're going to scream at someone, "Fix it." Sorry, this is nature. You just don't fix it. It is what it is. And, you know, nature tends to be pretty straightforward, but pretty brutal. There's a set of rules. You don't follow the rules. You know, it's not like you go back to go and start over again. You just don't. I mean, you don't start at all. You're done already. So when you look at this area, what you're looking at, and this is typical of all Micronesia, incredibly small pieces of real estate. Water is your primary concern, not just the access to fresh water, but the type of behaviors you have to ensure that you keep your fresh water. So one of the side effects of this socially is all throughout Micronesia, there's very rigid family controls in terms of the number of kids you can have, when you can have kids, where the kids are, and all sorts of stuff, which, as we'll see later, drives a lot of traditional Micronesian society, is the role of basically children. Because at some point, if you have too many kids, you end up like a Bai. And a Bai is not functional. A Bai is a disaster that's just waiting for the minute it happens. And, you know, and everyone knows. And yet you find that the behavior pattern, you know, that you put a lot of lawns down here, you have a golf course, you try to make it look, you know, public gardens, you try to make this look as classically American as possible, because this is an American military base. And at the same time, you know, the Navy knows this. They've had these studies going on since the 1940s. Every bit of water you're using up here could make this place uninhabitable. You know, this type of behavior is very 21st century, but it's stupid. There's just no other way to phrase it. So that's sort of the relevance of this. The other thing you can think about, if you look at this, because you have limitations in the amount of agriculture you can do, not only do you have a limited amount of land, but on top of that, you have a limited amount of fresh water that you can access to grow stuff. Because if you think about it, if you're growing a plant, especially a wet plant like say dalo or something like that, for every dalo or yam that you grow, that's water that you don't have to drink, because it's the same small bucket of water. So what you find is, even more so than in pollination, certainly a hell of a lot more so than Melanesia, is you're entirely dependent in large part on what the lagoon gives you. So in a traditional Micronesian way, this land is basically, it's dry land. That's where you dry out. You put your houses there, you put a little bit of crops there. You use the brackish plants, the coconut, the pandanus and stuff like that. You use those plants to do what you've got to do, to make cordage, to make nets, to make whatever. But this here is what you actually use the most of. Lagoons in Micronesia are actually some of the most productive real estate on planet Earth. They generate enormous complex biotic systems. And that's largely because huge as this thing is, and this thing is enormous, there's almost no predators inside because all your predators are pelagic, they're deep water. So you're going to find small sharks in here, but you're not going to find large sharks inside Kwajalein. So what you have here is you have this huge fish pond, for lack of a better term, but it's also shellfish and everything else. And so this is what you exploit. If you look at this, you know, if you think of this as water being the parent, then little bits of dry land around here are like, okay, that's like a boat. But this is what feeds you. The lagoon, the atoll is your life. And in much of Micronesia, what you found, one of the traditions is if you actually lived, for example, on Kwajalein, there'd be another one or two of these atolls around here that actually didn't have anyone living on it. That's probably a good case in point. Yeah. There's no one there. But I can guarantee that there's some families or some groups that have claim to this area. And they go over here on a regular basis and they would plant plants here, use the materials here, and fish this lagoon. So this lagoon would actually become an extension, if you would, of their home real estate. And so what you find is people might live on one island, but they actually exploit and use another whole cluster of atolls around them. Now, this is one reason why when the Europeans first moved into this area, they found people going back and forth all over the place. They assumed, oh, they didn't really live anywhere, they were nomadic. In other words, they're just like hanging around here for a week. They didn't realize that what you had is this was permanent. But when you went and used these areas out here as a way to supplement and also limit the amount of damage you did. Now, just as a note, you know, as we get into future stuff, Kwajalein Atoll is polluted. I believe 80% of it is considered toxic. So just since the 1950s, the United States Navy, combined with a massive amount of the local population there, has managed to pollute one of their basic food resources that this group entirely depends on, which, as we'll see, is one of the reasons, if you think of the video, this is why you get into this idea. This is one of the things sort of pushing the idea of Western food consumption. Status is a really big part of it, but also the fact that a lot of the stuff here, really, even if you can catch a fish here, a lot of this really isn't edible. It's like catching stuff in the alleyway. And if you think about, that's a mind-blowing ability to have a fairly small population ruin such a huge piece of real estate. But hey, you can't underestimate 20th, 21st century ability to pollute the crap out of places. Let's switch back. One of the other side effects, just sort of, if you look at it, just if you visualize that image, was the fact that, of course, then you have to be able to sail. So what you find is right into the 1960s, 1970s, it was extremely common in a lot of this region for people to go into little 14, 16, 18-foot boat and think nothing is sailing 200 or 300 miles across the open ocean. Now, it's not the same as sailing from here to Maui or something like that, which would be about, maybe about 80 to 100 miles. Those are large, tall, high pieces of real estate. You can see the one from the other. You know, if you're going to go to Maui and you start at Sandy Beach, all you have to do is climb up to Makapu, you can see Maui. And you've only got the channels. It's large pieces of protected real estate. Sailing across 300 miles of open ocean, when you're going from one piece of real estate that's 15 feet high to another piece of real estate that's 8 feet high, is a lot more iffy proposition because that's totally open ocean. That's more like sailing north or south here. You just sort of your butt's hanging up there. So you really got to know what you're doing. Classic example of this, though, was extremely common. In fact, you still will hear accounts, especially in the FSM, of a canoe being rescued or a small boat, aluminum boat skiff being rescued. And there's two guys in it, and they were there for like 60 days. You know, they had some crackers and some water, and they thought they were going somewhere, and the motor broke, or something happened. And everyone's sort of like, oh, whatever. And if they have some clue what they're doing, they'll be fine. There's ways to survive in the deep ocean if you know what you're doing, if you don't freak out. Westerners in the deep ocean, you know, they're generally gone in 48 hours. They have no idea what they're up to. They panic and they die. So the ocean can kill you, but the ocean isn't necessarily the ocean isn't a predator. It isn't out to kill you. It's your own lack of knowledge of it that kills you in most cases. So what you find is this is an area where deep water ocean voyaging was extremely common, much more casual than it was in Polynesia. It was extremely common here, as in the rest of Polynesia, to hop in a canoe and say go from Waikiki to Ewa or something like that. Much less common to go from Waikiki, for example, to Molokai. In the same way that you might go Moorea to Tahiti Island is real common, but from Moorea to go to Bora Bora would be you have to think about it. So sort of almost what would now be the same as you hopping into a car and driving to a McDonald's or something like that was sort of how people treated till maybe 40, 50 years ago, going across chunks of the Pacific Ocean in Micronesia. It was just an absolutely normal thing for people to do. And what that meant is their skill and knowledge levels of the ocean around them were incredibly high. Now, sad to say, they managed to lose that in about 2 generations. One of the last that was really a comprehensive knowledge base was Malpialum, who of course gets brought over into the Hokulea project here, because when they're starting to build the Hokulea and get it to work, they suddenly realize that they don't have enough knowledge of how the ocean works in the 1970s to actually make it work. So they managed to contact Mal in Sarawak in Micronesia and ask him to come over, since he was one of these guys that went around in the ocean all the time. He was a traditional navigator, to come and teach them in Hawaii how to relearn what they had lost. And so that's, you know, when you talk about the Polynesian Voyaging Society, it should be the Polynesian Micronesian Voyaging Society. Yeah, the stuff is Polynesian, but you had to learn a lot of the knowledge from Micronesians, then re-extrapolate into what you had in the Hawaiian language and stuff like that, and old traditional stories, what their version was. So Hawaiian navigation today in 2020 is not the same as Hawaiian navigation in 1750. It's probably maybe 70, 80% the same, but there's whole parts that have been lost and whole parts that ironically are new because they were typical in Micronesia, but they weren't, you know, maybe common knowledge here. So you see this a lot even when you talk about Polynesian identity and the idea of the ocean. A lot of that's actually been not reinvented, I don't know what you want to call it, re-something, in the late 20th century with the Hawaiian revitalization movement, which then also spills into the rest of Polynesia. If you go down into the Eastern Polynesian group, you find that people still go around to canoes a fair amount, but they don't do long voyages. So that had to be like here, that had to sort of be redefined, reignited, rediscovered, I guess is sort of the most polite way to phrase it. And that comes from Micronesia. Having said that, that generation, which is pretty much passed away, of guys like Mao, did not leave kids or younger folks who have that knowledge. So by fortuitous situation, the last generation of Micronesian sailors that really knew what they were doing on the ocean in a traditional way passed that knowledge, ironically, to Polynesians here in other parts of the Pacific. And so what you occasionally get, if you look at the Polynesian Voyages side, you'll occasionally see Micronesians there learning how to sail from Polynesians who learned it from the Micronesians' grandparents. But the Micronesian grandparents didn't give it to the Micronesian kids. So the issue of the ocean is really key. And if you think about it for a second, if you live somewhere like here, so you live here, and you have now lost, you live here, but you don't know how to sail long distances anymore. You are really, really up the creek without a paddle and almost without a canoe. Because if a hurricane hits, if anything hits, if any huge problem, if all of a sudden you lose your Ghyben-Herzberg lens, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go if you don't know how to go anymore? It'd be like if all of a sudden, no one knows how to drive a car. How are you going to get to Costco? How are you going to get to Walmart? How are you going to get the stuff home? You basically, lost the most central piece of your world in a world that consists almost entirely of water. You've lost the ability to use that resource, which is, at least in my view, just personal view, is pretty suicidal. So when you're looking at Micronesia, this is one of the huge issues that really doesn't get a lot of play, because what happens is if you look at contemporary Micronesia, as we saw in those videos, what you see is a huge fascination with Hawaii / the United States. But that's all fine to have that as an interest. But you can't have that as a model you want to emulate, because you don't have that. You don't have freeways in Kwajalein. You don't even have a lot of roads. And if you don't have the ability to get around and effectively use the ocean, which you're surrounded with literally within feet, you've got yourself in a huge world of hurt. And you're living sort of in an illusion that's entirely dependent on an outside world, outside resources, which is the major problem for much of Micronesia in the 2020s. So if you can just sort of go through this quickly and just see this whole sort of sequence. I mentioned the sort of habitation thing. I think I'll stop here. What I'm going to do is the next one, I want to go a little more into this whole sort of history thing, so I can note to myself. So with that, signing off and see you guys later.